Hi everyone, welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming, something that we are learning to do in this very interesting time that we're living through. Today's program, Deschutes by the Decade 1950s, is part of a series of programs that we have been partnering with the Deschutes County Historical Museum to bring to you in celebration of the centennial of Deschutes Public Library. We opened in 1920, and we are spending 2020 each month revisiting Deschutes County in specific decades. So in January, we started with the 20s and brings us into April, where we are going to be looking at the 1950s. Today's presenter, Kelly Miller, is the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She is a graduate of Portland State University with an MA in History. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And I don't know if you all can see my virtual background, but last week, Kelly, I think it was, you put up some photographs for people to use in Zoom meetings like this that are highlights of days gone by around Deschutes County.
Yes. I'm encouraging time travel during your Zoom meetings.
That's right.
So coming to people from the past.
Perfect. So I'm going to get off the meeting right now. I'm going to turn the screen over to Kelly, and I'll pop back on at the end and we'll ask some questions. So Kelly, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Where's my share screen? And here we go. Welcome to Deschutes by the Decades 1950s. Let's see what we have in store. This has been a really fun series to do with the library, as my clicker is not working. If you were with us for the 40s and the 50s, they kind of, there it is. Aha, so here is my population screen. We've been starting off each program with a look at our population statistics. And I owe Sisters an apology that during our program on the 1940s, I missed a big event, which was that the city of Sisters becomes an incorporated proper town in 1946. What does that mean? Well, in addition to meaning that they have their own functioning government and they aren't looking to the county for a lot of things, it means they show up in the census. And so prior to this, for our other Deschutes by the Decades, when we look at the population, we've only had statistics for Bend and Redmond, and now Sisters gets to join us because they show up in the 1950 census. So we're a population of countywide of 21,812 folks. The city of Bend is at 11,409. The city of Redmond is at 2,956, which is a 57% jump from 1940. And most of that is due to Redmond's growth around the airport. Last month's talk, one of the big developments during the 40s was the coming of commercial air travel to the airport in Redmond. And so that's reflected in the population statistics that Redmond is growing a little bit. And there's our brand new town of Sisters coming in at 723 people strong. So welcome, Sisters, to our census. And that can be my historian's plea for, please get your census turned in. It gives us important historical data that in 100 years from now, people will want to know. So don't forget to turn it in, mail it in, get online. It's super easy and quick. So 1950. That January 4th, the residents of Bend are greeted by the news that George Palmer Putnam has passed away in California at the age of 63. George was our former Bend mayor at the ripe age of 23 years old in its very early days. He was the owner and publisher of Bend Bulletin. He was a member of the Emblem Club, and it was his East Coast connections. You know, he's from a wealthy family back east, Putnam Publishing. He was a marketer like you wouldn't believe, and all of that came to bear in the early days of Bend to help us grow to the city that we are today. Even though he was only here for just under 10 years, his impact was rather large. And so it was with sadness that everyone learned of his passing at the start of 1950. Lest you think small towns have no exciting news going on, among the things that happened in the early years of the 50s, between 51 and 52, Bend gets its first traffic light at Wall and Franklin. Very exciting and probably frustrating. And it's enjoyable that the Bend editorial talks about how badly it was needed was shown by the fact that no less than 16 motorists were booked on the first day for ignoring the traffic lights. And then in Redmond starts one-way travel between 5th and 6th Streets. It gave residents much to talk about. The change provided a conversation piece for the business district where it seemed queer to see cars parked on both sides of the street in the same direction. So, you know, small town news, but big things were happening. So this is St. Charles downtown. This was the brand new St. Charles built in 1950. So we're looking from Lava Road on the edge of downtown, where today most people would recognize a hotel. But for decades, it was Hospital Hill, and this is before St. Charles makes the move out east. Similarly, in Redmond, this is the groundbreaking ceremonies in 1951 for Central Oregon District Hospital in Redmond, which would be a big deal for Redmond to have a larger, more modern hospital. But here's the really big news about how the 1950s start in Deschutes County. You're looking at Shevlin-Hickson Mill. This is about where the Les Schwab Amphitheater is today. Full up log pond has flooded that area. The burners are in full steam. You can see back here the cut lumber dried for stacking. That November of 1950, Shevlin-Hickson announced that they were closing. And that was a huge blow to the economy of Deschutes County. At the time, Shevlin-Hickson employed about 850 people in a town of 11,000. That was a huge loss. Of those 850, about 225 were working in Shevlin Camp, which was the logging camp for Shevlin-Hickson Mill at that point. They had years earlier gone from multiple smaller camps to one large camp known as Shevlin. And it was a town of 225 people that moved around the forest from spot to spot and had, you know, all the accoutrements of a small town. It had a school, it had a post office, it had its own, you know, band and all of the things that came with a small town. And so the end of Shevlin-Hickson also meant the end of that way of life as well. At its height, Shevlin-Hickson employed 1,100 people. Here we see their marketing materials that had come down over the years. They were one of the ones trying to label our local pine as Pondosa pine. Shevlin quality, build your summer cabin, with Shevlin log siding. But as this editorial in the bulletin shows, since the late 30s, both Brooks-Scanlon and Shevlin-Hickson mills, the two mills that were in what we know today as the Old Mill District, knew that the forest couldn't support both giant mills forever, and that the end would come eventually. And it was just that by 1950, the only thing that was going to keep both mills going was more trees. And mill managers had been hinting at this for a couple of years, and they admitted that the demand for lumber caused by World War II and the subsequent rebuilding of the world after World War II had meant that cutting and milling of lumber through the mills had continued to happen beyond a sustainable rate, and that it was no longer possible to postpone the inevitable, and they sell out to their competitor Brooks-Scanlon across the river. At that point, they had been operating for almost 35 years, and they had been, you know, strong community supporters of schools and all of the things that big businesses support in a town. So it was a huge, huge loss. It didn't help that it came just a month before Christmas. And in fact, the last actions in the forest were in the last week before Christmas. So it was a really hard thing for that many people to suddenly be out of work. We have a series of photographs in the museum collection that date from 1951 that are taken on color Kodachrome by Myron Johnson, who worked at the mills. These couple of photographs are coming from June and July of 1951. They were donated to us by his son, Chuck, who's a great supporter of the museum. Here you see, basically, you're looking at Shevlin-Hickson from the other side of the trestle that used to run and cross the river right about where the Colorado Dam is today, and the Whitewater Park. So here's the trestle. This would be where the Whitewater Park is today. Here's looking north towards Shevlin-Hickson. So all of these buildings are going to suddenly be vacant and sitting empty and falling apart for the next couple of decades, and just be a huge visual reminder of the economic loss of the mill. And again, here's the river and the train trestle right here. For those of you who remember the crane shed fight in the 90s, that's here. This is Shevlin-Hickson's crane shed, which was substantially larger. And that actually is going to be torn down in 1952. Here's that same shot, a little bit zoomed in to see the buildings a little bit better. So right around here is Mill A for Brooks Scanlon. And this is Shevlin-Hickson's main mills right here. Again, looking around the mill sites in 1951, thanks to Myron, one of the unique things about the 1950s in the mills is it's the end of horse logging for them. The 1950s, in a huge way, throughout the county, is a time of extreme change from the lifestyle of a small timber town for the first half of the 20th century to becoming something new. And one of the things that's lost over the course of this decade is horse logging and being replaced by, you know, nice shiny yellow forklifts like this guy, moving lumber around instead of by horse and cart. Brooks Scanlon continued to use draft horses in the mills clear up until 1958. They were beautiful creatures, well loved. Here's the green chain at Shevlin-Hickson and from the log pond. And here's the town of Shevlin that I was talking about. So this is taken at its almost last location, so that logging community on the move of a couple hundred people. This is a panoramic shot of it with the train loaded with logs ready to head into town to be milled. So all of those little logging camp buildings that you see out in the forest and around La Pine and repurposed as cabins here and there, a lot of them came from Shevlin Camp when it was dismantled during the 1950s. And I really wanted to emphasize that this was a town that a lot of these folks had lived together in this small community for a very long time, long enough that you would set up a picket fence and a sidewalk to your little movable logging camp house. So I always loved this picture, not only for the dog and the look on her face, but the picket fence, because even though it was mobile, they really took the time to set up and be a community. And that sense of community can be found in the celebration photographs that we have. So we're in these tiny little log cabins having parties, we're dancing, life is pretty good. No idea what this poor guy in the corner is he getting away with drinking something? I don't know, maybe. The piano going in the corner. This photograph actually is a farewell dance for the logging camp community of Shevlin. And then over here, we have the last Christmas card produced by the folks who were living in Shevlin Camp. Merry Xmas, Shevlin, 1950. And here we are back in town at the mills in 1951 with one of the horse-drawn pulley systems, moving cut lumber. Sorry, you can tell I'm enamored with the horse-drawn horses of the Brooks Scanlon mills. They're great. Come on, what's not to love about these guys? And 1958 is still, you know, an era when you would have expected them to be long gone by now. So who are these guys? This fellow right here is Frank Filey, and he was the barn boss clear up until 1958. He retires with the horses. So he had worked for Brooks Scanlon as the barn boss in the 30s and 40s, left the job for a little while, then came back and did the last 10 years. You can see back here in this corner is the corner of the Brooks Scanlon crane shed. So this building was located near Mill A, down in the Colorado, Arizona area of town that we know today. And so here's Frank again, and this is Tom Fair over here. They've both, in this photograph, just loaded hay into the barn for feeding the horses. I always loved that he retired at the same time as all of the horses. Part of the breaking things down and starting to see the mills shrink rather than grow, this is the train trestle that ran through Shevlin Park. And in 1956 and 1957, as they were taking apart Shevlin-Hickson, Brooks Scanlon started to shrink their own operations and started pulling up a lot of the railroad track out into the forest as we're transitioning less from railroads and more towards big trucks. So there's the trestle with a train loaded coming through the park. And then we're going to start disassembling it and taking it down. And we're going to also start taking up a lot of the railroad track along Century Drive into town at the same time. So there's the trestle coming down. And it's my understanding that a lot of the big timbers from this trestle were salvaged and actually went into an addition to the public library building. So if you've ever been in the section that today you can have meetings in, that part was built, some of it was built with lumber from this trestle as it came down. So Shevlin Park would have been a totally different place with a train running through it than it is today. One of the other major events, and this again speaks to the fact that this is a time of transition from one way of life to another, is the creation, the more permanent creation of Three Sisters Wilderness Area. And part of that comes from the establishment of the Friends of Three Sisters organization, a nonprofit group that formed specifically to fight for and keep and protect the Three Sisters Wilderness. So the Three Sisters Wilderness Area was actually designated in 1937 by the Forest Service at 191,108 acres as the Three Sisters Primitive Area, as it was first called. And then it had more acres added to it, about 55,000 in 1938 and 39. So you get to the 1950s though, and the lumber is starting to be harder to come by, and you have Shevlin-Hickson shutting down, but you still have Brooks Scanlon running as a mill. And Leonard Lundgren has formed his own mill in Bend in 1951. So there still is a push for timber and new timber rights to be accessed. And that pressure starts to come to bear in the Three Sisters and around it. And making those choices, you know, do you preserve and set aside as wilderness, or do you open up some of it for logging? That's a conversation Oregonians have been having and fighting over for a long time. And it came to bear again in 1954. The Forest Service sought to lock down and create a permanent Three Sisters Wilderness Area, but they wanted to shrink it when they did that. They were going to pull the 55,000 or so acres that had been added in the late 30s out and open that back up as forest land that could potentially be logged, rather than putting it in with the wilderness area. Well, not everyone was okay with that. This is Carl Onthank. He was the Dean of Students at the University of Oregon. He and his wife, Ruth, were very active in the Eugene Natural History Society. And it was Onthank working with some conservationists throughout the valley and in Central Oregon that formed the Three Sisters Wilderness Group. They are the first wilderness activist group in the Pacific Northwest when they form in 1954. And they formed specifically to fight the Forest Service removing those 55,000 acres And they get Senators Wayne Morse and Richard Neuberger behind them in keeping that 55,000 acres in with the wilderness area. And so when the Wilderness Act gets passed in the next decade in 1964, the original Three Sisters primitive area at its full size comes into the system as the Three Sisters Wilderness Area. So we have Mr. Onthank to thank for that. And the bulletin generally is supportive of this. It's interesting in this editorial where they talk about a family of mountains and its impact on the area and the objectives of the group, that they note it was Eugene, more distant from the Three Sisters than Bend, Redmond, or Sisters, that took the leadership in the protection of the wilderness area that surrounds the glaciated peaks. We had sort of looked on the Three Sisters on our own western skyline as eternal and had forgotten that their green skirts, spread over thousands of square miles in the lower country, might be sullied. So the bulletin in support of what was happening. An item, sorry, this isn't the greatest picture in the world, but one of the things in our collection are some of the letters and correspondence between the Three Sisters Wilderness Group and its members in Eugene and members of Central Oregon on how to move forward with the project. And this is a 1955 Three Sisters Wilderness Trails map sponsored by them. A little bit hand-drawn feel, but very nice. So this is the Three Sisters through that middle part of the century and what they were working so hard to protect. But the 50s, they are also, so logging is shrinking, wilderness and environmental protection, those thoughts are growing, but this is also the Cold War. And so one of the things that Deschutes County residents spend a lot of time doing and thinking about are watching the skies for enemy planes from red countries across the Pacific Ocean. If you took part in listening to our 1940s talk, you'll know that the Ground Observer Corps actually had started as part of World War II. But in 1952, during the Cold War scare, the Ground Observer Corps is reactivated, and the city of Bend actually was really unique. It had one of the largest filter centers for taking in and processing the accounts of ground observer volunteers and pushing that forward to Air Force in Washington, D.C. and at other forts around the country. It was the only city under 50,000 people in the entire country to have a filter center the size that we did. At first, it's all volunteer, and there is truly what they call a hut, a little plywood building on top of the O'Kane building on the corner of Oregon and Bond, is where the Ground Observer outpost started. It was almost all volunteer for most of its run between 52 and 53. Many, many, many volunteers, and they were operating 24/7, and it was done in 2-hour shifts to be watching the skies. We're talking 50, 60 people at a time throughout the course of a year were needed to keep that 24/7 observation of the skies going. But then eventually, because the filter center takes greater importance in the West Coast observer program, it becomes an official spot of the Air Force where they have assigned 2 lieutenants and 19 groundmen to oversee the operations. And they actually build a building on Wall Street near the Bend Public Library branch where it is today. Here it is under construction and almost ready to go. And they also had outposts in Redmond and in Sisters and in Prineville, and they also established rural homes. So farms, their houses, they could volunteer to be an observation point, and they could keep a log of their observations and turn it in to see if they had seen anything in the skies. And it's definitely one of those areas where the women of our community were able to sense opportunity and jump in and serve a role in protecting our country. That you have prominent women in Redmond. Here you have Mrs. David Silvers, and Clifford Dahl and Mrs. George Smith, unfortunately going by their married names, not their first names, running the Redmond Ground Observer Corps. And here we have Mrs. Charles Hines Jr. We happen to know her name is Bernata. Great that it shows up in this edition of the bulletin. She was a force to be reckoned with for Bend's 1950s Ground Observer Corps and responsible for recruiting to get people in and serving as volunteers. Oh, backing up just one thought, that by the time the program ends in 1959, it ends because radar is replacing human eyeballs. The city of Bend had over 105,000 volunteer hours just between 1955 and 1959, just watching the skies for enemy planes. The other excitement in the 1950s as we're transitioning from one type of economy to another is that Hollywood came calling. Hollywood had come calling before in the 1940s and 30s, making Westerns. We had nice open spaces where Hollywood film crews could set up and film horses and men on horseback, doing great charge scenes and looking like it was still the wild, wild west, which in some ways we kind of still were. This is the urban legend Fort Benham. Not great pictures exist of Fort Benham, unfortunately, but this is one that if you could see it a little bit clearer at its original size, you can see a pickup truck through the gates of Fort Benham here. But Fort Benham was famously built in 1955 by a movie studio owned by Kirk Douglas. Here we are on the interior of Fort Benham, getting it ready for its debut in the movie, The Indian Fighter. So Kirk Douglas had scouted out up here, built Fort Benham for Indian Fighter, but their hope was that it could be a permanent studio for more filming and for both television and movies. Here we have a color photograph of Indian Fighter filming in progress. Lots of locals got to be involved as extras. Some of them, unfortunately, being spray painted to look like Indians because it was root digging time up at Warm Springs. And so their hope to draw Warm Springs Indians down as extras didn't always pan out. If root digging festival time happened, that took priority over movie making, obviously. And so sometimes local residents would be spray painted in the way that Hollywood used to do and show up as Indians in these movies. Here's Kirk Douglas with the 1955 water pageant court, looking as handsome as ever. And boy, if that doesn't have movie star smile written all over it, I don't know what does. Another movie famously made during this time, lots and lots of locals served as extras, was a film called Oregon Passage. This is Lola Albright and John Erickson, who were the stars of that film. Canyon Passage filmed around Smith Rock, around Fort Benham, and up at Crooked River. Fort Benham also served for the television show Have Gun Will Travel for a couple of episodes, but it quickly fell into disrepair, and being out in the forest and away from town, it was subject to vandalism and teenage underage partying, and the worry was that eventually someone would set it on fire and burn down the forest. So the Forest Service took that action themselves before anyone else could get around to it. Some of the other fun in the county during this time period, we get our drive-in theaters. It's interesting how many people would love to have drive-in movie theaters come back around. I am one of them. So Bend Drive-In Theater opened along Cooley Road where Les Schwab is. If you go Les Schwab towards Highway 20, that is, towards Highway 97, right in there, before you get to Lowe's, is where Bend Drive-In was located. When it opened, adults, it was 55 cents, children 20 cents, and 10 and under were free. One of the big things that the drive-in marketed to folks was that it solved the babysitter problem because you could just bring the kids along and have them fall asleep in the back seat of the car. When it opened, the big movies showing on opening night in 1952 were Chain Lightning with Humphrey Bogart and Red Canyon. Bend Drive-In could host 400 cars when it opened, which was quite good. And similarly, we had the Otomito Drive-In open up in Redmond. So here is a shot of Otomito. This is where Wagner Mall in Redmond would be, where Albertsons is today. And for quite a few years, KBND was the only radio station going. It had no competition until the 1950s. Redmond gets its own radio station, KSGA. And television. Television makes its way. We don't often think about that today, but television was starting to make its way into American homes in 1948, 49, and then in 1950, television sales in America just explode. But where we're located, it was very difficult for us in Central Oregon to finally get television. So the first Oregon television station happens in 1952 out of Portland, KPTV. But we're surrounded by mountains. So how does your antenna pick up a broadcast from Portland? Well, it doesn't unless you have another antenna that is helping bring that reception past those mountains. And so one of the ways that television gets to town is that a nonprofit group formed in Redmond, and then the Redmond JCs out of the Chamber of Commerce tried operating it, was the Grizzly Television Corporation. And so they called for people to pay to be stockholders in this, and using those funds, that's the money that they were going to erect the Grizzly Mountain antenna that would help bring Portland television signals to Prineville, Madras, Redmond, and Bend. So they actually do succeed in getting enough money together to put the antenna up. And in 1957, the Grizzly Mountain antenna goes up, and very quickly, 2 years later, it's reported in the newspaper that, come on, everybody, you're all getting your television for free. Nobody's paying any dues, and we're going to go broke and out of business and be unable to keep the antenna going. And in 1955, that competition gets a little bit stiffer. So it's really difficult to get an antenna up on a mountain and bring that signal into Bend from Portland. But what doesn't need that as much? Cable. And in 1955, television was coming to Bend. This is September of 1955. And it's 2 days before the big fall festival in downtown Bend. And as they report, many of the stores downtown would have televisions in the windows hooked up to be showing everyone the brand new broadcasting available through Bend TV cable. It was $149.95 for installation to get cable set up in your home, which oddly sounds like a package deal you would get today, but in 1955 dollars, that was a lot of money. And you would probably have paid around $180 for a television set. So it was a spendy proposition in the mid-1950s to tap into the brave new world of cable television. Here part of the cable programming did come through this antenna here, though, that was erected on Butler Market Road, east of town. But here's the really big shift. So if at the beginning of the 1950s, we've lost Shevlin-Hickson and cut our logging operations in half, and logging is going to start the slow decline. It's going to take a couple more decades, but it's going to become less and less and less a force in our economic world. What we get in 1958 is only going to grow, and that is the dream of Mount Bachelor. So Bill Healy and Gary Gills are both members of Skyliners. From previous talks, you can remember that the Bend Skyliners Club was the outdoor recreation group for Central Oregon since 1928. They had taken a hiatus during World War II, but they had started up membership again in 1954, and they had gotten the Tumalo mountain ski area going again, play area, and but they were eyeballing Bachelor Butte. And so urban legend has it that Gary and Bill are on Bill's porch and they're dreaming and scheming of opening Bachelor Butte up as a bona fide ski area. And one of the things behind this is that Bill Healy famously was a member of the 10th Mountain Division during World War II. And one of the characteristics of the 10th Mountain ski groups over in World War II is that they experienced European ski lodges and ski resorts, and they brought all of that back to the United States with them. So across the country, you see many war veterans who were part of the 10th Mountain starting and operating ski resorts across the country, and Bill Healy was among that group. So over here, you'll see from the newspaper in 1958, the planned development. Not very elaborate. It was a way to get started. And you'll see that the special permit had been granted to them in 1958. And in fall of 1958 is when Bachelor Butte officially opens as a ski resort. $25 shares were sold to 180 people to produce the $100,000 that they needed to get it started. It opened with one pommel lift and 2 rope tows. It had a 30 by 50 foot lodge called Egan Lodge. Sorry, here we've got Bill Healy with the construction of a chairlift a little bit later on. And here we have Gary's high school senior portrait is all we have of him. But there we've got the 2 original dreamers and schemers from that porch talk. And here we have Egan Lodge. And nice little Volkswagens and station wagons parked for skiing for the day. Here's a shot of Egan Lodge as it was when it opened, that 30 foot by 50 foot. Egan was James Egan. He was the Forest Service supervisor. The Forest Service was very involved in the creation of Mount Bachelor. They very much saw it as a way to get folks out and into the forest and recreating. So that first season, 1958 to 1959, they had a little over 29,000 skier visits. They were open for 86 days. There were 5 days that the snow was too heavy to get in. Here's the part you'll all love. Daily tickets were $3. An individual season pass was $50, and a family season pass was $85. Not too bad. I bet everyone would love to have a shot at prices like that today. And we all know what a driver Mount Bachelor will become for the tourism and new economy that Deschutes County is moving towards as logging is shrinking. Tourism and recreation are going to start taking over and replacing that, and Mount Bachelor will be a big part of that. This is an early brochure that's in the museum's collection. It's actually probably from 62 or 63, but shows you the original logo that they had going. And lots of exclamation points. Community-wise, a big shift in the city of Bend. Here we have Bend High School, which we know it today as the Bend Lapine School Administration Offices. It had been the high school since 1925, but the community was starting to outgrow it. And so a new high school was built over on 6th Street, and that's the Bend Senior High School that we know today. It was a big deal to move from downtown. It kind of also shows a shift away from downtown core. As we're starting to move town more east. This is a shot, again, I'm sneaking a little bit into the 60s, but this is an aerial of the high school taken in 1965. And you have the football field and track under construction down here. And here's the front of the school that we know today. And next door, not too far away, and a big highlight of high schoolers' lives. This is the Midget Drive-In, and this is Bea and Lawrence Clausen, who ran it over here. And the Midget Drive-In was across from Bruin Field, which was the original football field for the school. So lots of high schoolers would hang out at the Midget Drive-In over the course of the day and on school nights. And as we're wrapping up, just to prove that we weren't totally a hick town that was, nowhere near anywhere and not connected to the world because we didn't have television and we only had 2 radio stations. This gentleman right here, if I can find my notes, is Harold Williamson. He's playing and singing guitar over KBND airwaves from the Pilot Butte Inn in 1956. So even though we are struggling to get television, we are struggling to have more than 2 radio stations, Elvis Presley can, not be kept away from anywhere at that point. So here's Harold Williamson doing his best singing and dancing, even though you couldn't see him on the air for KBND. So by 1960, our growth is stagnating, isn't it? That logging collapse that's coming is really going to hurt over the next couple of decades. And by 1960, we're only at 23,100 people. It's only a 5% growth. The city of Bend is at 11,936. Redmond is at 3,340. And Sisters has actually shrunk. We've had a 16% loss. They're down to 602 folks. So that's what I've got for the 1950s, a time of great change and headed towards new opportunities like Mount Bachelor. And Liz, I don't know if you have any questions for me.
Hi, Kelly. Let's get our faces back up there on the screen. Want to?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, or maybe not.
That's the challenges of Zooming.
It's true. So I do have a couple of questions, but this is gonna. Okay, there we go. There.
I see you.
I see you. So when you were talking about the little logging cabins that they would live out in Shevlin,
Yes.
did those they took them with them when they moved on to other camps?
Yeah, so that was the goal, is that you could build more rail track, you could load it all up on and just go to the next part of the forest that you were ready to log. There's lots of urban legend stories about it. Lois Gumpert, who served as the postmistress for Shevlin, I believe, claimed that there was a time where it would happen so quickly, like the mill managers would decide, okay, camp's moving, and not everyone would get word very quickly, or you only had a small amount of time to lock things down and pack them up. And Lois claimed that there was a time that they moved camp suddenly. She had left her mop bucket in the kitchen, but that the building moved and not a drop of water was spilled. They were so very, very good at moving these from one place to the next. So yeah, you can recognize them by their size. They're designed to fit on, railroad trucks. And they normally have these little cable guides up at the tops of the eaves of the roof so that a cable can get hooked to the bottom. It'll have its guide by the roof, come up to the crane, and get lifted on and off of a railroad truck and get packed around town.
And would they hook them up to electricity when they would?
Yes, yes. When Shevlin closed down, when it's in this couple hundred people place, they would stay put for a couple of years. So yeah, you would have electricity, you would have phone lines, all of that would get run into it. You would have gas pumps attached to tanks so that you could be getting gas. They would set up, a full operating functional community, and then tear it down and move it to the next place.
Awesome. Okay, so I was fascinated by the drive-in.
Yeah.
First movie I saw was Jungle Book at the drive-in.
At the drive-in.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, when did the drive-in close? The Ben Drive-In.
I don't have that off the top of my head. I apologize that I should have anticipated that question. But I think the late 80s, and then in the 90s is when both spots get cleared off and Wagner Mall in Redmond gets built. And then it takes a long time for the spot where Les Schwab gets built on North Bend off Cooley.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about history and the buildings that we choose to hold on to versus buildings we choose to, or whoever chooses, to knock down and make room for progress. And I'm wondering, what from the 1950s, were any buildings lost that you regret?
Yes.
Person?
Yeah, that's a great question. Drake Lodge in Drake Park is lost in the 50s. In 56 or 57, Leonard Lundgren had purchased it from the Masonic Lodge. So when the Drakes leave, it becomes the Masonic Temple and Temple. All of their buildings were called temples. Theirs just happened to be this really cool log cabin on Drake Park. And they build a new building off Greenwood behind 7-Eleven. If you're driving down Greenwood, the Masonic Temple is behind 7-Eleven there. That was brand new in 1956, 57, and Leonard purchases Drake Lodge and unfortunately makes the choice to tear it down.
So is there any other, or is that just sort of the most?
That's the biggie during the 50s. A lot of small houses come and go during this time period, but that's the biggie.
Awesome. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today for this online programming brave new world that we are existing in. It's always so nice to visit with you about Deschutes County's history. And next month we have the 60s. Want to give any preview for what we can expect during the 60s besides really mod clothes?
Besides really awesome clothing.
I'm going to dress up. Are you?
Oh, sure. I'll see what I got.
Okay.
Well, I will tease you that 1960 starts out with everyone being obsessed over the fact that a Redmond police officer had a UFO sighting in Redmond, and they were demanding answers from the Air Force. What had been seen over Redmond skies?
Perfect. That is a great teaser.
Yeah, the ground observers didn't have much to do anymore since they had lost their role in 1959, so they had to go spot UFOs.
They got to find something to do. Kelly, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we look forward to next month.
Yep.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.